Well, thank you for joining First Draft's reporting on coronavirus webinar series. First Draft is a global non-profit that supports journalists, academics and technologists working to address challenges relating to trust and truth in the digital age. My name's Anne Kruger and I'm joined by co-host Ali Abbas Ahmadi. Say hi, Ali. Waving. And also we have a special guest, Chrisanthi Giotis. So today we'll be discussing how to include global voices. We'll have insights that you can use in any reporting and highlight issues for you to consider and put straight to use with reporting on coronavirus. Now today we encourage your participation, as you heard earlier in that intro. We'll stop after each of our key areas for questions throughout the webinar and also in general at the end. So first we're going to focus on how the Australia-Asia region is fitting into an international collaboration on coronavirus and some of the issues that we're seeing in this region daily. You can consider and put them straight to use with your reporting. You'll see a lot of what we discover is racially based, and while we'll show the problems where disinformation is spreading fear and racism, we hope that from today that you'll actually be able to understand what questions to ask about different cultures, to see how they might be vulnerable with disinformation, and how this is linked across the world and how it plays out in different local contexts. But importantly, we aim to offer some hope for solutions on how to better represent the communities that are affected. So after that, our second section, Ali will give us a deep dive into India and what you need to know there. So Ali, do you want to say a few more words about what we can expect there?
Sure. So really quickly, I'm going to talk briefly about India, but using it as a case study to sort of show how journalists, or how really anyone who's interested in India or in a new country can and should report on it based on certain things that they need to know, and then to learn to apply the same criteria to any new place that they're covering or are writing about. So that's a little bit about what I'll be talking about today.
Great. And so Ali is based in Hyderabad. He's normally in the London First Draft headquarters, but went and visited family and is now in lockdown in Hyderabad. So late morning to Ali there. It's afternoon where I am, so I've just pulled down the shade. But also joining us in our third part will be Chrisanthi Giotis, who gives us a template, if you like, on how to gain a deeper understanding of different cultures and really think about what types of reporting you'll do. So there's Chrisanthi on screen now. So Chrisanthi's worked most recently to help the Australian Financial Review's new Indonesia correspondent to not only prepare and find different stories and angles to the, shall we say, rather tired and repetitive ones, but her trainings have also had a profound impact on the responsibility that reporters often realise that they share with the local communities that they're reporting on. So I'm really looking forward to having more of a Q&A with Chrisanthi at the end. So while we at First Draft use elections to galvanise newsrooms and generate public interest, our research is also helping newsrooms globally to make sense of coronavirus. Now, as I mentioned, Ali is based in India, so every afternoon I check in with him as he starts his day and provide an editorial handover, and we compare and contrast some of the different themes that we've been seeing online, some of the different talking points, and just sort of track what's happening there. So there are some, general characteristics, I suppose you could say, of coronavirus misinformation that we're seeing. I'm going to focus on, well, throughout today's webinar, Ali will look at a little bit at some of the local groups and questions of trust there. I also want to deal with this number 4 there. If you see how misinformation often involves a kernel of truth. So if we combine closed messaging apps and that point there, I have an example from our friends in the US who are monitoring some of the spaces in Chinese language apps, and just this is amazing how the connections can be made. So there was a closed app message that was circulating in Chinese communities in late March, and it took some Australian media coverage of the Prime Minister Scott Morrison's comments about the US being the country of origin for most of Australia's COVID-19 cases. And this was presented as evidence in this closed app message that the virus shouldn't be linked to China. Now, the message also accused a Hong Kong microbiologist who'd identified a Wuhan market as the origin of the outbreak and criticised China for not shutting down wildlife markets back in the day of SARS. And so the message was saying, right, this Hong Kong microbiologist should refer to the arguments and scientific data from the Australian Prime Minister. So there's that kernel of truth. In the interview, the Australian Prime Minister did say that the country which has been responsible for a large amount of coronavirus cases in Australia has actually been the United States. But he noted also that at the end of the day, that's a function of the number of people that travel between the US and Australia. And he also said, you know, this is a virus and that it's originated in Wuhan, China, and gone around the world. But you can see how easy it is for different messaging apps to pick up on one piece of information. And what we're doing though is we're thinking about, well, who are the audiences, who are the communities that are receiving that information? And it's fine for us, we can cross-check, and we've got fact checkers, and you know, we're news hounds, we're used to looking at different information. But we really want to think today about, well, what about the communities? What about those audiences? What information are they getting? So just a very quick recap as well. I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with the 7 types of misinformation and disinformation belonging to information disorder. We are seeing all of these play out in the work that we're doing, the monitoring that we're doing over coronavirus. I'll give you a few examples. Here's an example of a cross-check research piece in Australia that we've been monitoring. It contributed to news stories such as this one from the ABC. And basically it's where fringe groups from 5G to anti-vaccination have turned up in mainstream communities. Groups in Australia typically will link back to the US and to European fringe movements where they've got quite a large base, and we're monitoring and seeing how this is playing out in Australia. And also then I talk to Ali every afternoon and say, you know, are you seeing this? Have a look at that. So anti-vaccination and anti-5G groups on social media during the pandemic are certainly concerning, but they're not the only things that we're seeing that are exploiting the COVID-19 crisis. We're seeing different racist narratives and memes, including this one that combines anti-Chinese and anti-Muslim sentiments. Ali, do you want to pick this one up here and have a little bit of a chat about why this is so sensitive where you are?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in India, unfortunately, a lot of the chatter around the coronavirus is racist in some way, shape, or form. So it's either Islamophobic, which is predominantly what it is, or it is it's anti-Chinese. And so this image here, we haven't included the caption, but this image here is what was being shared very much on Indian social media platforms. And I mean, it basically, most of the tweets and the messages around it were sort of talking about how China was the quote unquote producer of the virus, whereas the Muslims were the distributors of the virus. And so this is a much more sort of sinister type of misinformation that is really, it is really there to harm. And I think if you look at the trajectory of India over the last 5 years, there have been more Islamophobic and racist incidents that have happened in the country. And so it's quite clear to see that there are some elements of the society that are very clearly exploiting this pandemic for their own gain. And you can see that very clearly in the digital sphere.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali. And so then when I'm crossing over to Ali every day, I find out that information, and then I'm looking at it more, and we've seen that these are being picked up by extreme far-right Facebook groups with Australian and Indian admins. One of the prolific groups is posting about 800 posts in a day. So our team in Australia here saw anti-Muslim, anti-immigration themes online in Australia during the federal election. That narrative was ramping up, and also in the wake of the New Zealand Christchurch massacre. So it was important for me. I found a lot of insights learning from Ali about the sensitivities and the dangers related to Islamophobia in India. So this brings us to something we've been saying for a while at First Draft, that, you know, we've seen an uptick in this anti-Islamic hate speech online, and in Australia we've seen a lot of anti-Asian sentiment on the rise as well. And unfortunately these racist views find a receptive audience in this climate of fear that we're experiencing, and conspiracies about where it originated from are not helping. I'm sure you've heard a lot of the conspiracy theories that are going around, everything that covers Bill Gates to, you know, the origins, you know, and you know, whether or not it's been, you know, manufactured, those sorts of things. So unfortunately that creates this us versus them narrative, and we saw it again quite strong in Australia today with our monitoring, and it's just further deepens that divide and that racism, and you know, really hinges on that fear. And so Chinese communities were targeted quite early on in Australia, and racist views found a receptive audience in that climate of fear when there wasn't, you know, much information. And now, of course, it's almost like there's too information. So unfortunately, we're still seeing it play out. And the First Draft team have debunked a number of different posts and rumours from early on, and we're still seeing these narratives play out in Australia, even in the most, you know, recent sort of days and weeks. But the idea is to be aware of these narratives so that we can help understand the vulnerabilities, and also to inoculate against the communities, you know, provide information to the wider mainstream community so that we can, you know, just think a little bit more about the communities that are being affected. And I am seeing that happening more and more in mainstream media as well. Another thing that I spotted was this one in my monitoring. So Ali, I actually asked you about this one, if you want to let everyone know.
Yeah, this one. So I remember when Anne had sent this to me, and she said, Ali, can you take a look at this, because it seems a bit crazy. And I think it took me a few seconds, but I realized very quickly that this was just a piece of satire that had been produced by an Indian satirical news outlet called Foxy. And it was just, you know, sort of, I think it was very much a type of clickbait type of article, but at the same time, like very soon after, I found that this was being shared on a number of like social media channels, especially on Twitter. And I think that shows that knowing the reality of different different parts of the world, like in India, for example, the fact that I knew that this was a piece of satire right from the beginning allowed me to sort of recognize that. Whereas if someone from a different part of the world had just seen this and used it the way a lot of people did, then I think it obviously can and has been used to malign, in this case, the Pakistani and Muslim community.
Yeah, because that one, I think I saw that one when there were the very first questions when, you know, people were sort of wondering about antibodies and you know, what happens with people who have tested positive. So this one was pretty quick to get on the bandwagon of that. Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned, this is, you know, we're highlighting these things to see how things move around the world. We have volumes of examples that we can share, but the idea of this is to really understand, you know, what are the communities that are affected? How can we be building this into our narratives a little bit more? We actually have Jennifer, who you heard earlier. She is standing by in London at the moment, and she is ready if you've got some questions. She might take over, and let's just break for a little moment and see if there's any questions that you've got so far about just what we've shared with Crosscheck before we get into our next section where we'll do a deeper dive with a case study in India.
Hi guys, so we have a question here and it says, any thoughts about COVID Safe app?
Yeah, so that would be the Australian app for our international audience. I'm assuming that's referring to that one, which is a hot topic in Australia. And I think the latest numbers from today are over 3 million people have downloaded that one. So I guess probably the biggest concerns there are with regards to privacy issues. You know, the Australian government is encouraging everyone to download it because this is a tracking, so that it can trace, you know, people that have had tested positive to COVID-19, and everyone has downloaded it, if you've been within 1.5 meters of someone who tests positive and you've been around them for longer than 15 minutes, then you will get an alert. So that's basically how it works. Look, you know, I guess it comes to a point where you've got to trust the government. I mean, that's, you know, as far as, you know, we're looking at things like misinformation and disinformation, there would be, I think for us with our monitoring, we're just looking to see, constantly go back to, you know, what is the official information here. There would be a lot of conspiracy theories. It's that type of topic where people will make rumors about this. So I think it's a matter of cool heads can prevail when making decisions about this sort of thing. I hope I'm talking about the right one that you were referring to there. There's various other ones that I know Singapore have been using.
We have another good question. Have you seen videos shared without context? Videos from Europe, for example, or the US?
Yes. Yeah, so I think this is one of the issues that we have, is that a lot of videos or a lot of content actually in Australia will pick up on what's happening in the US, and it will be picked up and reshared here. Ali, are you seeing, I know it's definitely a case here in Australia, are you seeing some examples that stand out from memory in India?
Yeah, we've definitely seen videos and images. I think more photographs in India have been shared. I mean, there's a lot of them are quite, of course, dangerous, but there are some like benign ones. Like, for example, the whole the pictures of like nature reclaiming parts of the urban landscape, and they show like pictures of our rivers and stuff with dolphins and whales and whatever animals that never really live there, to be honest, as well. But a lot of those images and sometimes videos as well end up coming over from Europe, and more maliciously, there have been videos that I remember there was a video from, I think, somewhere in the UK, where there was a protest by Muslims on the street somewhere that ended up becoming violent for some reason, and that was being shared as if it was happening in India, and sort of talking about, oh, look at these minorities, etc., etc. So yes, we definitely have seen content from Europe, and I'm sure from the US as well, although I can't recall at the moment.
There were the 5G examples as well that we saw, videos used of, it was actually from Hong Kong. There were towers that were covered up, and it was old video from during the protests last year in Hong Kong. And so protesters were covering up, you know, obviously, so that they weren't getting caught on camera. And this was used and certainly circulated throughout Australia, that it was 5G towers that were being attacked. And so old video was used to, I guess, add to some of the debates and some of the protests that were happening actually overseas with regards to that one as well.
And we have another question here. How well do you think the media is doing at discovering the misinformation circulating in closed groups?
Yeah, in closed groups, it's difficult, because as our slide showed earlier, it's actually, you know, quite difficult to be caught, I suppose, in the closed chat apps. So we're monitoring that. I think a great method is when you have tip lines as well. I think we are seeing, though, that a lot of the time some of the closed chat apps, and even in the last couple of days, I've had examples of conspiracy theories that people will get a message and then it's like share widely, share widely. So it's getting shared on, you know, wider Facebook feeds. Ali, you might be better placed to talk about how WhatsApp works. I know you're going to be talking about WhatsApp in India, but I don't know if you wanted to mention something now, and then maybe you can elaborate in your section as well.
Yeah, I mean, monitoring closed groups, especially a platform like WhatsApp, is a nightmare, to be honest. And for whether you're a journalist, whether you're a law enforcement agency, whatever, you know, it's very difficult to do it unless you're, especially when it comes to WhatsApp, unless you're directly hacking into someone else's phone. And I'm going to talk more about WhatsApp because in India, WhatsApp is what everyone uses. We don't use a lot of Telegram or Messenger or Signal or any of that. But yeah, like there are a lot of examples of misinformation just being spread, misinformation that I receive from people that I know, from the groups I'm in, whether it's a friends group, whether it's an uncle who's sharing something. And so, I mean, all I've been doing is sometimes trying to talk to whoever sends it to me, you know, and trying to find out where they got it from, and trying to sort of piece together where a piece of information came from. But of course, it's incredibly difficult because you can never see that. So, I mean, in terms of the question, I'm going to say I don't think a lot of a lot of media organizations are doing much to track misinformation there, but also because it's virtually impossible to track without the help of the platforms themselves.
Well, I think we might move on actually to your section, and I think that's a perfect segue if you want to talk about yeah, we've got this case study for India, so I might hand over the mic to you.
Sweet, thanks, Anne. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a perfect segue actually. So as a journalist, right, when you're covering, or even if you're just a person who's interested in a new part of the world, but especially as a journalist, I think the most important things that you need to know before going into a new country is you need to know the context. Every place, sometimes or very often, even different regions of the country work differently. So the most important things that you sort of need to think about before venturing into a new place is you need to know the culture. So what is the culture like? The practices, the languages that people speak, understand what makes the people tick, what their values are, what is important to them as a community, not necessarily individually, but to sort of see how you can represent that particular voice in your reporting while being faithful to it. Otherwise, very often you see very strange stereotypes and sometimes very obnoxious and very offensive stereotypes as well. Even a well-meaning journalist very often does put these forward, and sometimes that's simply because they haven't done enough research, they haven't understood the place well enough. And I'm going to use India as an example. Admittedly, a very difficult example if you're an outsider coming here, because we do have 1 billion people. But I think I'm well placed to sort of talk about this because I've lived abroad. I was in the UK. I was supposed to be in the UK now as well, but I've been in the UK for the last year and seen how their media covers India, and now I'm back here and sort of am able to compare. So sort of dive right into India, really. Context is absolutely everything. And I think that it's absolutely essential for someone who's coming from outside to get a feel for the place before they can really write about it. Next slide, please. So I think when it comes to India, right, I would say there are 4 or 5 different, I'm going to say, cleavages that cut across every other line in India, right? So one is caste, which is the social stratification idea or concept in Hinduism and the Hindu culture. There's class, so like economic class, religion, language, gender, and history. And in India, all of these are always at play in every issue, whether it's politics, whether it's whether it's this current pandemic. These are always the things that affect the way the government can respond at all, and of course they affect the way in which anything is being reported on. So a quick example is even something like history, right? So if you as a foreigner are going to come to our capital, Delhi, and you want to report about it, you want to write a story about it, the most important thing there you need to remember is that, so in 1947, just after the Second World War, India was divided into two countries, India and Pakistan. And what most people don't realize about Delhi is that during that division, more than like millions and millions of people changed over somewhat. So a lot of people went from Pakistan to India, a lot of people went from India to Pakistan. And that resulted in a complete population change in Delhi. So pretty much overnight, the composition of the people, the languages they spoke, right? So earlier there used to be a sort of quote unquote sophisticated sort of class in Delhi, more aristocratic from the older empire that we used to have, the Mughals. They used to speak Urdu, it was basically much more a place of poetry, if you will. And overnight, pretty much, once all of these people moved to Pakistan, the people that came into Delhi were from the more rural areas. They were speaking a different language, right? They spoke predominantly Punjabi, had a completely different culture, different value set. And so the Delhi you see today is very different from the Delhi that there was just, 70 years ago. And so if you're writing anything about Delhi or its people, it's absolutely essential to know that. And if you didn't know that, then you would misrepresent it in some way, shape, or form. It's very likely. So that's just an example of how and each of these 5 or 6 things that I mentioned play across every story in India. So that was the first thing. The second is you need to know how Indians communicate, right? And in different parts of the world, people use different social media. In India, WhatsApp, as I mentioned earlier, is by far the most used platform. So 82% of Indians use WhatsApp, according to the Reuters digital news report from 2019, which is a massive number when you consider that we have over a billion people, right? And I think the interesting thing that you need to think about, especially from a misinformation point of view here, is that now both WhatsApp and the internet itself, right, are relatively new in India. So it sort of developed very quickly and reached all corners of the country in just a few years. And what that has meant is that WhatsApp is now reaching parts of the country where people there's no culture of Googling anything, right? There's no culture of checking if someone is telling you the truth or not. And so that has meant that this part of the population, and remember, this is the majority of India, this part of the population is very easy to convince of anything. So, for example, if I send someone in a rural town who is not familiar with Googling or anything, if I send them a doctored image, they are not going to be able to know the image is doctored because they don't know that Photoshop or doctoring images is a thing, right? And I think that is a very important point here when you're thinking about India. And secondly, when it comes to WhatsApp as a platform, every time you receive a piece of information, or at least most of the time, it's from someone you know and someone you trust. And so that makes it much more difficult to look at the information you receive with a critical eye, because if a family member sends you something, you're more likely to believe it, right? Of course you are. Your mother or your sister or your brother is sending you something. Of course you're going to believe it. So that's the second thing, is knowing how people communicate in India, and indeed in any part of the world that you're going to cover, is absolutely important. Third is, I think when I was covering other parts of the world, the first thing that I was told was read the local news, which I think I'm sure all of us know that is essential, right? In order to understand part of the world, you read what they read, you read the news there. The problem with India is that you need to read more than one newspaper or watch more than one news channel. And that's simply because each outlet is biased in some way, shape, or form. Each outlet has its own politics, has its own biases, and this is absolutely essential to understanding the news. So yeah, and I mean that plays very heavily into the way any topic is covered in India. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear that, but that is definitely someone selling potatoes. I'm sorry about that. If you guys have any questions while he or they move forward, I'm going to mute my mic. But if you have any questions in the meantime, I'm sure you can ask them.
I think it's good because today it's potatoes. Other days when I really do these editorial handovers each day. It's been grapes and watermelons, so I'm getting to know the culture quite well through Ali. It's fine though, Ali. I don't think it's particularly interfering with the webinar.
Okay, sweet, perfect. Sorry. In that case, I'll just move on. So that was just a quick bit about the news, and to give a very quick example about how the coronavirus has been covered here. So you have these media channels with different political biases. Some of them, or a lot of them, often are covering just one part of, say, there's been this group of Muslims called the Tablighi Jamaat. You might have seen that in international news as well, that have been accused of spreading the virus. Just like that meme we saw earlier, they were basically accused of distributing the virus across India. And so some news channels, all they do is focus on that, and that's the only thing you see. So if you're a foreign reporter and you happen to watch or read one of those channels, that's all you would think, right? You would say that, oh, why has this group done this, and why are they still moving around the country? On the other hand, a lot of the other channels have spoken only about the government and only about what the government has not done. Whether they're right, whether they're wrong, it doesn't matter. They just end up bashing the government in one way, shape, or form. And so understanding this bias and understanding this difference in India is essential, and of course in every country is something that you absolutely need to know. And so I think that leads me, and I think leads all of us journalists to some questions, right? So if you're covering India for an international audience, how do you cover a place like India? Do you simplify it? Do you try and quote unquote dumb it down because there are so many different layers to it? What can you omit? Like, what can you omit while staying faithful to the actual story? So for example, if you're covering the coronavirus and the situation in India, can you actually leave out facts such as India only, in the last 10 years, India has only spent something like 3.6% of its GDP on healthcare, while other OECD countries, other comparable countries have spent over 8%. So would you be faithful to the story if you didn't report a fact like that or something like that? Would you be faithful to the story if you didn't talk about the discrepancy between the private healthcare versus the public healthcare, and the fact that most people in the country, like 80% of the people in the country, would go to the public healthcare simply because they can't afford the private hospitals? And I think these are the questions that all of us as journalists need to ask ourselves when reporting about a foreign place and when trying to include a foreign or a global voice. And I think what I've used to try and prepare myself for this when I'm covering a new place is, after the same way I've analyzed India in this presentation, I've tried to ask myself if there are any similar lines, any similar cleavages like class or religion that cut across wherever it is I am covering. And perhaps a useful exercise would be that for each of us to look at our own country, try and see if there are those lines, what they are, how they affect the society, the dynamics, the politics, and then try and use the same criteria in other parts of the world. So yeah, that's my little bit about India, and I hope that made sense.
Okay, let's go back to answering some questions. So We have, do you think international and national media is trying to cover up the exact figures of COVID? And if it is like that, what is the reason behind it?
I think that's a very hard thing to answer personally, and that's partly because I think that as we've seen, the coronavirus is a very new virus. So that means that a lot of us don't, a lot of governments, a lot of doctors, a lot of healthcare professionals are not entirely sure how it works. So I don't necessarily think that they're deliberately like media especially is deliberately trying to cover up a lot of things. It just might be that the agencies themselves, the healthcare professionals themselves, are finding it difficult to accurately count how or why a person has died or has got sick or whatever. And of course, that makes it so much more difficult, right? Because we're still in a relatively new stage of the virus. Yeah, there have been thousands and thousands, unfortunately, of deaths everywhere. But I'm not convinced, and Anne might have a different view on this, but I'm not necessarily convinced that there is some conspiracy to try and cover things up.
I agree, Ali, and I think it's interesting because the numbers that are being tested, and per percentage of the population is really different in every country. So that's something that we need to be mindful of as well. And I know in Australia here there is an effort to ramp up the testing as well. So there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration. I would certainly say there is a concerted effort by the media here to try to get those numbers right, and report that accurately. Are there any other questions regarding the India? Was there anything, Jennifer, that came up specifically about India in the questions?
No.
No? Okay.
So we can move on.
Okay. Great. Ali's explained everything. Sounds good. Well, I want to just talk a little bit now, a little bit about my experience overseas. So, and I'll bring in Chrisanthi soon as well. So I've spent probably most of my adult working, or my working career anyway, in Asia, in between Singapore and Hong Kong. And I always began there working in local media for a number of years. And that really helped to shape my knowledge of where I was. In particular, when I moved to Hong Kong, I was working in local media for, gosh, probably 6 years. And my closest friends now, the ones that were at work teaching me a phrase a day of Cantonese, and the ones that are my actually my better friends are the ones that were quite strict with me and saying, no, that's not good enough, those tones are terrible, try again. So that's actually how I got to know, this amazing rich culture and history in Hong Kong, and also to do with mainland China. And then I got, I guess, what was a dream job in international news. And it was quite interesting because I thought if I hadn't have had that experience working in the local media, I probably would have landed in this international newsroom with a different perspective, I suppose. And I could often see, not necessarily that particular newsroom, but just, looking at the news media, and how there was this important thing about different nuances to really understand the local culture there. And that in particular was quite strong for me during Occupy Central in 2014. I guess a lot of times you hear about Hong Kong being, this travel destination for shopping, and it's finance, it's business, it's East meets West. But in Occupy Central, we had this fast ramp up of misinformation and disinformation about the protests, and a lot of that was spread on closed messaging apps, and again used fear and lack of information to do that. And so I was part of a fact-checking group that started a Facebook page to debunk a lot of these myths, and they had nearly 100,000 Facebook likes and followers within the first 24 hours. Such was the need. And the thing was, this was bilingual, so it was first up getting the information in Cantonese, and then adding the English translations as well. And I found this really effective for the nuances. And if I had just relied on English media, I feel that it would have been a bit slower anyway to get those nuances in the reporting there. And in particular, I think one thing that I probably find frustrating is, I think a lot of people, when they see you reporting on Hong Kong, is they often don't get the of what it's like for the local people, and in particular the young people who can never afford a home or an apartment there, a tiny apartment at that. And this actually weighs heavily on the local population there, and weighs very heavily on the mental health situation for the people. And I still to this day don't feel that we get that sense of the gravity of that situation. We just hear, about the shopping and about, the finance situations. So that's where I'm actually going to bring in now to talk about her work, because I've found that, so Chrisanthi is based at the Centre for Media Transition at the University of Technology, Sydney, which is where First Draft is based. And Chrisanthi is a postdoctoral fellow at the centre, conducting research on journalism best practice, and she focuses on local global, the interface there, that's and examines the type of reporting that foreign correspondents produce from refugee camps. And Chrisanthi has just put into words really well, I think, the experiences that I've had in Asia, so well that she's written a whole PhD on it, and lots of other books, and developed what's called a frame reflection interview to help journalists prepare for overseas postings. So we'll hear about this in a moment, but it focuses really well on connecting with diasporas and transnational communities living in Australia. So welcome, Chrisanthi. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you, Anne, for having me.
So you've got some great lessons, which I think you can give perspectives for journalists who might not necessarily be on overseas postings, but are reporting on global communities, and certainly as we all are in our own homes at the moment. So we'll talk about your main case studies that focus on Indonesia in a moment, and how you helped the Australian Financial Review prepare for their new foreign correspondent post. But I just want you to just tell us a little bit about yourself first. You're from a Greek family in Australia, you've worked in Africa, just tell us a little bit about yourself and that journey to what you've developed.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, so growing up Greek Australian, I always had at least two points of view from the media, but more often far more. So I grew up in the most multicultural neighbourhood in Sydney, which is the most multicultural city in Australia. And so I grew up with all these multiple narratives from the news. So I realised very quickly that mainstream Australian media wasn't telling the same story and wasn't reporting things in the same way that we were experiencing things in my neighbourhood, which was also in the bottom 10% in terms of socio-economic disadvantage. So then we have that experience. Then I've reported from refugee camps in Palestine, in Sudan, and in Indonesia, with refugee community there, not camps. What I again discovered was that, the perspectives were very complex. And perhaps the biggest wake-up call was in Sudan, when it was just after the South Sudan split, and you had the international media talking about this incredible success story, and then what I was seeing on the ground was very different. And that narrative was actually being hidden on purpose by the international non-government organisations, because they had sponsored the split so heavily. And since then, we've seen that actually, there's been huge problems since then. So with Sudan and with South Sudan in particular, although Sudan has actually benefited from the split, even though they were the ones who didn't want it, because they've democratized. Anyway, the point is that you have these different perspectives. And so then that was my sort of clarion call to go into academia and to think about how we can do this without, spending 6 months traveling on public transport through 10 African countries, which is what I did. So how can we develop a shortcut? And I actually took some work from that was done by MIT professors in policy, and I applied it to journalism, and I came up with this thing called the frame reflection interview. And the way that I transferred it from the world of policy to the world of journalism was by going into our local multicultural communities here and asking for their perspectives on how something like a refugee camp in the Congo should be reported. What are the stories that are not being told? And what media were they accessing, and what stories were they getting from their diverse media, including their, not WhatsApp at that point because it was 2014, but including their Facebook groups and including their individual messages. So that's how the frame reflection interview came about. And this is from my first testing of the interview when I went to the Congo, and I went there specifically because of the massive stereotypes and the difficulty, and one of getting a non-international perspective on the Congo as a white person. And one of the major things that came out is actually that refugees see how we represent them, and so they learn to speak to that narrative. And so there's this thing called NGO speak, which they also do for journalists. And so breaking through that was actually the most important thing that the frame reflection interview helped me do, because I was looking for these other narratives which my community participants in Australia had told me to look out for, who were all former Congolese refugees themselves. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And so closer to, I guess, to Australia, we often see that reporting of Indonesia by Australian correspondents seems to lean on some recurring themes, a little bit like what I described with Hong Kong. Can you expand perhaps on some of what some of these more well-worn themes are, and then how you helped the new correspondent for the Australian Financial Review to deal with that?
Yeah, so one of the biggest well-worn themes is that Indonesia is an authoritarian state, and the other one is that it is a radical Islamic state. So these are misrepresentations of Indonesia that are common in Australian media. And so I bring up these two specifically because the Australian Financial Review correspondent who participated in this program, we found five people from the Indonesian diaspora living in Sydney who she went and spoke to. And these were two of the big themes that came out from those community members that they would like redressed. So for example, one of the interviewees, the way that we do this, is by sharing 3 different stories, short 2-minute video stories, and then getting them to talk through those stories. So the stories are chosen to demonstrate different topics and different framings. And one of the interviewees picked out the opening line of the story and was like, but why did they use that line? It makes it sound like Jokowi is a dictator. It doesn't make it sound like a rational choice. It makes it sound like an authoritarian government when it's not. We have a democracy, And the participants were conscious of this because it affected their lives in Australia, and they didn't want to be seen as coming from this country that never changes and that hasn't changed. So that was a big one. Reporting Islam in a faithful way, and Islam's and the religion in general and the way it works in Indonesia was another thing that was a big issue for our participants. If I can actually go to what Ali was saying earlier. You just go back to the other slide. And so Ali talked about the partition between India and Pakistan as a huge fault line. Maybe some people will know, but Jakarta is Indonesia's capital, and the administrative capital is being moved. And this is actually something with which one of the participants brought up, is saying this is a hangover, like the concentration of services in Java is a hangover from colonial times. So that's why it's a good thing that the capital is being moved. So that decentralization is actually a decolonization as well. And having that context, Emma was then able to actually bring that into her reporting of the move of the capital. And talk about the fact that actually maybe it'll be a good thing for the environment because the forest is already industrialized, and the ministers here means that environmental issues will get solved quicker. So those sorts of impacts are very difficult to see if you don't have that context. And obviously that was not being talked about by any other journalist because she had already been reading all this stuff. Okay, so yeah, so with the reporting of Islam, we've noticed in her reporting since the interviews that she's really gone out of her way to talk about the role of women in particular in Islam. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, like this is, as it says, you know, the female CEO of the Indonesian second largest mobile company. And she did this amazing feature on her. And one of the really interesting things was that, oh gosh, I just saw the time. Okay, we'll just go on maybe to the very last point that I think it's really important to raise, that this process is about trust. If people are not seeing storylines that represent their experiences, then they don't trust the media, and that's how disinformation spreads. So I think that that's actually a really important process, part of the whole point. It's not just about addressing stereotypes, you get that shortcut of knowledge, but you also, the community members really appreciate it. So we had responses from people who had just seen the advertisements for the interviews, like to be community participants, saying, thank you so much for doing this. I don't want to be a part, but thank you so much for doing it. So it's actually about building trust in the community. And yeah,
I think it's a good example. I think it's a good example. If you want, I think we've just got a little bit of time to explain the example with the way the women are represented in Islam. Yeah.
So actually, if we go to the next one, so obviously this is the foreign minister. So when she was first appointed, the way that her appointment was represented in The Guardian, for example, was, you know, first female foreign minister in the world's largest Muslim majority country. But you see that actually the way that Emma represents her is, sorry, you can't actually see that here, but the way that Emma talked about her was the sort of this superstar female foreign minister in the world's fourth most populous country. So, you know, really actually not trying to repeat those stereotypes by mentioning them, right? By putting it in the context of the world's largest Muslim country, you make it sound like it's something unusual and, you know, it's not supported by the people. But talking about her as this superstar in this country actually sort of makes it much more obvious that this is something that is quite normal. You know, like that women are quite respected in these senior roles. So yeah, I think that's definitely part of it.
And I love your approach, getting the local diaspora communities involved there as well. I think it works. It does good. You know, it's helpful for both countries and the communities there. Is there anything, do you have any final sort of tips, I guess, Chrisanthi, on, you know, here we all are working in isolation from home at our desks. No one's about to hop on a plane and be a foreign correspondent. But I just think out of like all that method and the types of interviews and you know, connecting with the local communities, do you have any sort of tips on how we can do that whilst we're based from our home office?
Yeah,
or living rooms.
Yeah, this is a really good question, because part of the method was all about connecting with people in their community, you know, in the diasporic communities However, I think that we can do it. So one of the key questions in the method is asking people what stories aren't being reported, and also saying about stories, you know, is this reportage fair? What's missing? So, you know, if you're sharing a story because you're trying to find out more information about it, ask what's missing. Or if you're looking at misinformation, think about that kernel of truth and ask why are people believing this? Not like to get answers because they're stupid, but what's the important thing that this is telling us about society? So I think what we can do is sort of ask those questions like, what are we missing? Because like I said with NGO speak, one of the big things is people are really media literate. And so they watch a lot of news and they know what sort of stories journalists are looking for. And so they want to be a part of that. So they tailor their answers for the news narratives that already exist, and actually breaking through that and saying, you know, what else should I know? What am I missing here is really important. What stories aren't we telling? And especially, obviously, with multicultural communities, that's a great resource.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm just wondering, Ali, is this resonating for you in India as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think when you spoke about especially local communities and multicultural communities and trying to bring them in or help them inform your reporting, I think they are absolutely a great resource. The only thing is that sometimes I think that, I mean, I've seen that backfire a couple of times. So maybe thinking about it while they're talking to them is sometimes important. But I think generally just using them as a resource, and of course, as you mentioned, knowing the context, trying not to repeat stereotypes, even sort of even if they're not in your face stereotypes, but just trying not to talk about, like always talking about women in Islam, for example, right? Is I think essential. Yeah.
If I can just talk about that backfiring, that's a real issue. And one of the key things is that we're not using the community participants as sources for stories. All we're doing is trying to get what narratives are out there, what discourses are out there. So there was a great point in the chat from Laura Garcia about conspiracy theories in Mexico flourish because they're anchored in the distrust of a historically corrupt government. So it's getting to that issue of corruption and how it influences people. You know, that's the sort of thing which came out very strongly in the frame reflection interviews that were done with the Indonesian diaspora. The other thing, like with the COVID Safe app that was mentioned earlier, so one of the issues is that because we have poor reporting of Islamic communities also in Australia, but the way that foreign correspondents also report Islamic communities overseas, we have targeting of local Australian Islamic community. And so they have far less trust in police, and they're far more targeted by police, obviously. And so, you know, when it comes to something like the COVID Safe app, you are going to get, you do get, I know, conspiracy theories running around about that this isn't safe, you know, for targeted communities. And not even conspiracy theories, just people being more wary, you know. So yeah. It comes back to trust.
And I thought, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, also on that misinformation there. So I live in the largest Muslim majority neighbourhood in Australia, and I know that there's misinformation about Ramadan and that social distancing isn't being adhered to. And because I can look out my window and see all my neighbours, because I can see like 50 neighbours because I live in a very dense population, I know that that's not the case. And yet when I went to visit my parents on Easter, you know, because I was handing over a care package because they're elderly and my dad's blind, the neighbourhood there was packed with Anglo people not adhering to social distancing. So, you know, because people aren't seeing this, because we're not getting those narratives, then misinformation can flourish.
Yeah. And one thing also, Chrisanthi, is, I guess, what was the effect of this on the reporters? Say, take for example Emma Connors, this experience. What sort of effect did it have on her?
So it was fantastic. It was much better than I could have hoped, actually. So she came away from the experience really talking about her responsibility to represent, well, for one thing, to represent Islam and women correctly, because she was seeing such a difference between the way that her community participants were talking and the way that mainstream Australia was talking. But also, so she works for the Australian Financial Review, which is a newspaper which unashamedly takes the CEO's point of view. You know, that's their main audience, right? And yet, what we've noticed with Emma's reporting since doing the interviews is that her reporting really brings in this nuance of how development and even things like nationalization happen and foreign investment happen in a country like Indonesia, and how it has to take into account the rich-poor divide in Indonesia, and how foreign investment in particular can sometimes miss actually developing the poorer parts of the nation. So that sort of nuance is not something that you expect from a financial paper. And that was something that our community participants specifically asked her to do, to really bring out that rich-poor divide and to talk about development. And they also talked about the fact that, you know, the way that nationalization is viewed by many people, nationalization of industries. So that's, yeah, the fact that she talks about it in quite a nuanced way, I wonder how much that's had to do with the interviews.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I'm just wondering if we have, I think we're probably up to time now. Jennifer, did you have anything to add there, or I think you wanted to share?
Yeah, so we have 5 minutes left in today's webinar. Before we take our last question, I wanted to thank everyone who's joined us today. Your feedback is valuable to us. I just added our feedback survey to the chat box. We ask that you please take 2 minutes to complete this. The link can be copied and pasted into your web browser. Thank you, and I will move forward with reading out the last question. Okay.
While Jennifer's looking for those last questions, I've just got up on the screen to just a reminder of all the resources that we have on our website for First Draft. We've got resources for reporters, and we've also got an amazing coronavirus course as well.
Okay, we have our last question here, Anne, and it says, how are conversations changing with families and friends? Are people becoming more aware of misinformation and the role they play? Are there public service campaigns or announcements trying around this?
That is a fantastic question. And you know, I've seen a lot of families are kind of divided sometimes with the information. So a lot of conspiracy theories are feeding in, and someone will get their information, or they'll be sharing WhatsApp messages, and then there'll be another family member that will see that message. And the issue is, how do you approach that? Because, you know, when you have some information, you have to be very respectful to your family members, or you should be. And so then how you convey that information to the family members when you're trying to, you know, give them the truth is something that has to be approached, I think, delicately sometimes. So I always know for myself, before I just dismiss something, I make sure I've got the links to what I need and the information, you know, there. And I'm quite precise about things, and not just dismissing them and say, well, okay, that's interesting. Where did you get that from? Because there's actually this information here. And I think it's probably the same, you know, and probably even more so, I guess, you know, Ali, in India, with, you know, particularly with the prevalence of WhatsApp. I'm finding it's quite interesting. I'm seeing a lot of different, communities and different groups and, networks and friends. And I'm seeing it's quite tricky because sometimes you'll see things that might look like it's a hospital report and it's come from what looks like authoritative types of names. And so they'll see that. And you have to think, oh, actually, there's a lot more digging that you've got to do, because there are other scientists who are saying, no, this, they're not actually, these are not solid peer review reports. Let's wait and actually show some evidence. So we're just being bombarded so much with information, and then to try to, counter the different rumors. And I think then you've got, intergenerational, families, whether they're under the one roof or connected through closed messaging apps, and there's probably a lot of conversations going on, I think, and how to approach that. Do you have any tips on that, Ali?
Oof, that is a tough one to just have tips for. But I think for me, when I'm talking to a family member or someone about either something they've sent me, I think there's two things. One is kind of like I try to focus more on their behavior and less on the content, if that makes sense. So asking them why they're sharing stuff in the first place. Because if it's about the coronavirus, it's most likely because they're afraid. All of us are afraid at this point in time, right? So trying to understand the psychology behind why they're sharing something and why this thing in particular, and of course where it came from, is, I think, something that is important. And secondly, and I think perhaps crucially, is I try not to expect a change in behavior overnight if they are indeed sharing a lot of misinformation. And that's simply because I think I'm sure all of us are guilty of this. We get into habits, right? And some people get into the habit of, the moment they see a message on their phone, they just click forward and forwards. So expecting that to change immediately, I think, is, especially depending on which generation they're from, etc., is sometimes unfair and also very difficult, simply because, as you mentioned, Anne, we are completely surrounded by information, and therefore completely surrounded by misinformation and conspiracy theories and etc., etc. So I would say those are the two tips: is just keep trying to correct them, of course, but don't do it rudely, obviously, and just don't necessarily expect them to change tomorrow.
Yeah. And I think that question also alluded to, possibly some public service announcements there as well. We've certainly seen a lot of that, public service announcements. And I think I would like to see, some more announcements that are guiding people, to look at, more reliable sites and think about where they're getting the information from. I'm just bringing up a slide here. For journalists, we've got plenty of tools and resources here on our website. So if you go to firstdraftnews.com/coronavirus, plenty there with our resources. And also we have our online course, which I'll just bring up as well there. And I particularly like this course because you don't have to feel like you've got to sit and do it all in one big go. Like it's really, there's some nice short pieces for you to fit in around your day. But Jennifer, I think we've probably just got time for one more question, and we'll be almost on time.
Sure thing, Anne. So we have a question for Ali. What is it like in Hyderabad, where there's Muslim majority, if that's right? Is there less misinformation about Muslims spreading the virus, and perhaps misinformation targeting Hindus? How are the dynamics in Indian states where there's younger Muslim representation?
First off, Hyderabad, there are very, very few places in India that have a majority Muslim population. Hyderabad doesn't. We have I think 30% or 25% Muslim. 25% of the city is Muslim, and the rest are Hindu. And that is quite significant compared to most other parts of the country. So I would say that there isn't necessarily less misinformation here. I think, to me, I feel like, so as I mentioned, since a lot of the misinformation is over WhatsApp, and my community, I'm a Muslim, and so a lot of obviously most of my family is Muslim as well. So the misinformation that I do receive from them does of course sometimes target Hindus, but not very often. I think it targets more certain specific politicians in different roles, whether in India or abroad. So I think that is most of the stuff that I've seen here. And I think at the most of the misinformation that I see about Muslims at the moment is on open social media, so like Twitter or Facebook or something like that. I see a lot of it there, and of course, unfortunately, in the actual mainstream media. So there isn't necessarily, I don't think just the fact that I'm in Hyderabad means there's less anti or Islamophobic information. I think it's just all over the country, and perhaps that's because this has been a trend over the last few years, right? That now it's just become normal no matter where you are. And secondly, I think there was a part of the question about the dynamics in Indian states where there are more Muslims. At the moment, I think, well, with the virus, it's very difficult to say because things have completely changed, right? But I think in terms of what I have seen, especially in terms of health, is that it seems like Muslim communities are more distrustful of outsiders. Perhaps that's because outsiders are more distrustful of Muslims. It's sort of like a vicious circle. I'm not sure where it began. It's very difficult to sort of unravel that. But there does seem to be generally an increase in the amount of mistrust there is between the communities, which I think is extremely dangerous and extremely scary. Not least because I'm a Muslim and an Indian, and it's not easy to see, but it's also not easy to counter just as a journalist or just as a person, because it seems like it's coming from more influential and powerful figures in the Indian establishment. I hope that answered your question.
That was great, Ali. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we've certainly used up our full time allocation. Thank you all. It looks like you've all stayed on to the end, so really appreciate that, and thank you for being involved and engaged with your questions. Do find us on the website with the resources there. I hope it's been beneficial for you and you've got plenty of takeaways from this. I know I speak to Ali every day, but it's just great to hear him with his examples again today, and I just keep learning more and more. So we will wrap up. Thank you so much for joining First Draft's Reporting on Coronavirus webinar series. My name's Anne Kruger, and thanks for joining us with our co-host Ali Abbas Ahmadi in Hyderabad, and also to our special guest as well, Chrisanthi Giotis, who is in Sydney. So I think we've all really enjoyed our catch up. So please feel free though to contact us at First Draft via Twitter. And for additional resources, of course, please visit firstdraftnews.com/coronavirus. See you online. Thank you all.